Hello, and welcome everyone to another episode of the Attuned Spectrum podcast. I am so grateful today to have two of the authors and researchers of the PDA Experience Report from PDA North America. So today we will be welcoming Melissa McKenzie and Diane Gould onto the show. I need to share one of the most impactful quotes from the PDA Experience Report, from how I see it. So I am giving credit at the moment. So this is authored by PDA North America within the PDA Experience Report. The message from these surveys is clear. Families are navigating PDA with high stress, uneven recognition, and supports that too often miss the mark. Formal diagnosis and affirming treatment remain rare. PDA individuals and their families are often misunderstood and suffering. And it is because of this specific statement and how it resonates with myself and with everyone listening and all the work that PDA North America is doing, as well as so many others and organizations around the globe, that this conversation is absolutely necessary. Melissa McKenzie, PhD, is a former clinical psychologist and current homeschool parent who discovered in adulthood that she is AuDHD PDA and twice exceptional. With a background in research and clinical work focused on aggression, self-harm, and suicide risk, she now brings that perspective to neurodivergent advocacy, research with PDA North America, and the development of a homeschool program in North Atlanta. We also have with us Diane Gould. Diane is a licensed clinical social worker that specializes in serving autistic individuals. As the executive director and founder of PDA North America, she founded the annual PDA North America conference held in Chicago that has changed the lives of hundreds of PDA, pathological demand avoidance, or persistent drive for autonomy families. She has also co-authored the book Navigating PDA in America with Ruth Fiedler, which was published in June 2024. In April 2024, Diane was diagnosed as autistic. Diane has a private practice in the suburbs of Chicago where she serves neurodivergent children, adults, and their families. Over the last 40 plus years, she has worked for both private agencies and school systems. Diane has always been fascinated by human behavior and has worked to better understand and support individuals with distressed behavior over the years. She currently focuses her practice on providing consultation and training, working primarily with parents and regularly attending school meetings alongside them. Diane loves to train educators and therapists so they can better serve their students and clients. It was this understanding of behavior, autism, and the supportive approach in the PDA literature that first drew her to learn more about PDA. And learning about PDA led her to begin the new PDA movement in North America. Diane formed PDA North America at the first American PDA conference in March 2020.
Thank you.
Okay, and without further ado, I am going to pass this over to Melissa McKenzie. Melissa, did you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, maybe your mission within your research or in your family life and your personal life? And yeah, we'll just dive into these really impactful findings within the PDA Experience Report.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us. I'm excited to talk about the survey. I was telling Diane a little bit earlier, I'm like, I will talk to everybody about the survey. I think it's just such an important piece of information that families need. I think that treatment providers need it, educators need it. I know there are people who are in our corner supporting us, and to have that documentation, I think, is a huge step so that people have something physical they can hold on to and say, okay, I'm not alone. Thousands of other people have reported similar experiences. So yeah, I'm happy to chat about it. I have been in the PDA space for probably, I think, about 3 years now, just kind of navigating it with my own family, figuring out the educational piece of things. We accommodate nervous systems that need certain aspects of life that are not the typical box that we all think that everything should fit into. So about 3 years ago, I went to the PDA North America conference for the first time, and I've been nudging Diane ever since to let me do some research. So yeah, last year we put this survey together. We've got a few thousand people responding. And so now we're figuring out, okay, how do we get this information out there? What are next steps so that we can keep the ball rolling? Hopefully get, some people in the research space to join us. So if there's anybody listening that has an interest in
Yeah,
that, feel free to reach out. So
absolutely.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Melissa, for that intro there. Before we jump into those findings, Diane, would you like to introduce yourself as well? And then we can dive right on into the biggest passion at the moment, I think, within this conversation, which is understanding PDA and supporting those who are PDA and the families who are doing their absolute best to make life in their nervous systems a bit easier and sustainable.
Yeah. I think, maybe to start with, just the whole PDA effort started the way I think everything starts with a mom who wouldn't take no for an answer. I had been working with a family of a young adult with a autism diagnosis, and she found PDA and kept sending me article after article until I would pay attention and really read them. And as soon as I did, I was like, oh, this totally makes sense. And I got trained somebody in the UK on PDA, and then decided to see if I could hold a conference. And I think what blew me away then is really what still impacts me now, is that families from all over kind of tell the same stories. They describe their child so similarly, their struggles so similarly. And it just seemed like something needed to be done. So I just did PDA North America on the side as part of my private practice for the first couple years, but now we're a nonprofit and growing so quickly. And we don't really have time for fundraising, but that will happen one day. But I'm delighted at the growth and the interest and the support, because our community is so strong and wonderful. And people like Melissa have come forward at the conference to help. So it's made all the difference.
That's great. And it does, I think, just that coming together and even just hearing you talk about the growth and I actually loved what you said about, it started with a mum who wouldn't take no for an answer, because I also hear that, and like personally that was
Yeah.
me. And then with the families that I support within my Raising PDA and just within our local community as well, there's so many like factors at play. And that's why I loved the PDA Experience Report, because I think it's really hard to find evidence, because it is emerging within, the
Yeah.
research community, that not only is academically sound, because I think a lot of people still are looking for that, but they're missing the piece on the fact that PDA individuals, especially those late diagnosed or like late realized PDA individuals, they've been left out of the conversation or just realized their neurotype so late in their life. So
Right.
I think it's just so important that you've done these surveys to actually gain this lived experience perspective. And I love how it's across from like childhood age group up to like that 18 and then plus. I will pass the conversation over to Melissa. Melissa, I would love, and I'm sure the listeners would love to know what you have found to be the biggest eye-opening shifts from the research.
yeah, absolutely. Probably the first thing to hone in on, one thing that was a big goal. We had a lot of big goals in trying to figure out what to put in the survey. And the problem was, how do we narrow it down so that we don't have an insanely long survey for people to fill out? But one of the main things that we really wanted to target was, what does this actually look like? One of the things I think in the research space that people are struggling with is, how do we define this? How do we measure it? If we are going to try and diagnose this, how do we do that? And so we wanted to put together what we thought were some of the core characteristics that we've seen in the literature so far and our own experiences, to see whether or not there was a consistent portion of characteristics that people were identifying with. And across the board, we found a fairly cohesive identity around what PDA is like for a lot of individuals. And the two things that really stood out, which for us was not really surprising, but again, it kind of helps to solidify this is real. One of the things was the struggle to do things that we're, feeling pressured to do, but also the amount of people who identified that punishments and consequence based outcomes made things worse. And so for me, that was one of the biggest things. I know in the under 18 group, we had parents reporting on the experience for their children, and 94% said if we present punishments, if we present consequences, that typically makes things worse. And that goes against so much of the behavioral model that people are exposed to when they go in to try and get help from a treatment provider. And so that one to me, I'm kind of like, let me just scream that one from the rooftops. Like, guys, we have to really take a completely different approach to thinking about this. If 94% of these parents were like, no, this makes it worse, this is not working. So I get a little excited when I say it. So
Yeah.
I would say from that perspective, knowing that the variety or the majority of people across the board were saying like, yes, this is a cohesive identity. This isn't just one person saying like, oh, I don't like it when you tell me what to do. This is a lot of people who are internally struggling with the demand and that pressure. Diane, I don't know if you want to add anything to
Yeah,
that.
that's perfect, I think. That's perfect.
And it's funny, well, not funny, but as you were speaking to that point, Melissa, I actually was taking little screenshots on my phone because so much of like, and the biggest screenshot that I was like, I need to make this my screensaver was, and it had to do, I believe, with that really high percentage, that 94%. To be incorrect there, but it was that parents are finally saying that there are other people who are experiencing this within their
Yeah.
child, and there were the words that I had screenshot that said, feel like this is believable, like somebody actually believes me, or it could have been that that they didn't feel believed. And I think that piece, that validation, at least from my perspective, is just so important when you're working against a lot of really experienced and trained professionals who may not have the skills and the training. They may have the really nice intentions, but so much of what professionals are trained in and know is that behavioral aspect. And a lot of parenting as well kind of is embedded within that. And yeah, so I just thought that was really nice to read as a parent myself within the report, to go like, it's not something I'm doing. It's
Right,
society
right,
doesn't get it.
right. And
Yeah.
professionals, I'm a professional, so I can say this. I mean, professionals have a history of blaming parents for their child's behavior. And, that does a lot of damage. And we do a annual conference every year, which is how we started, but now we've just finished our seventh. And I think the power of the conference is for parents to be in a room with hundreds of people or on Zoom with 500 people just who have similar realities. And it's so validating. You feel
Yeah.
so seen and, you
As
know,
a parent who was at
yeah,
that conference for the first time
yeah,
3 years ago, I had just dipped my toes into what PDA was and, needed to do my deep dive, needed to figure things out, and was debating, like, do I fly out to Chicago for this conference? And then ended up doing the Zoom version. But it makes a huge difference when you feel like you're not alone. Like,
right.
so many people in your sort of immediate world might look at things and be like, you're not being tough enough, or you're doing this wrong, or you need to shift your perspective. And it's like, no, in my bones I know that something
Yeah,
else is
right.
happening. And then to have other parents just get it, it's amazing to have that community with that kind of a message. So I agree.
Yeah,
And you guys did that with your report and with your conference, which is just like pats on
thanks.
the back. That is so special.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. Yeah, I just love the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We're proud of it and
Mm,
excited by it. I mean, it's such a privilege.
Mhm.
it is. And something else that I hear so often, because PDA, it's amazing. We've got this upcoming research, and your research that you've done here is showing that there are so many traits that everyone is experiencing or sharing. Hey, like, this is real. This is what it is. This is what my child is experiencing, what I'm experiencing as a parent, if you're a PDA parent yourself. Something else that I hear is, does PDA exist within the autism spectrum? Does it exist alongside ADHD? Are there other comorbidities that exist within that? I also support a lot of families who their teenage children have had an oppositional defiance disorder diagnosis. So I think there's just a lot of, I don't know if it's lack of clarity or the research is just still being done, but I would love to know, Melissa, if you could speak to that within the research. What have you found there?
Yeah, this was another area where we really wanted to make sure we had something to say. It's a really complicated space because you're talking about, from, a research perspective, you're talking about trying to operationally define a human experience. And we're not inside the human. We can't really, test it the same way we would, like, let's go get a blood sample or, X, Y, and Z. So we're limited in how we kind of theoretically construct different ideas, and then we have to measure that based on different characteristics. And across the board, you hear people all the time say, okay, well, is this a profile of autism? Oh, well, my child has ADHD, my child has OCD, my child, struggles with sensory processing, my child is 2E or gifted. And you have all of these overlaps, and then you have to kind of figure out, okay, well, are they just overlaps? Is it somebody who's
Right.
experiencing two different things at the same time? Or is this all part of the same construct? And we're definitely not there where we can, with any confidence say something that specific, but we did want to look at, for the families who were filling out our survey, how many of them were experiencing characteristics that may fall under a different diagnosis as well. And so autism, ADHD, sensory processing, those were our highest ones. The majority of participants, especially in the under 18 sample, had said that yes, they had received a diagnosis of autism as part of an evaluation and or ADHD symptoms. So those are the two primary ones. And that seems to be what I think anecdotally we hear in the space as well, that there is a big overlap. So yeah, I think that there's definitely more work that needs to be done there, but at least we have kind of a baseline to say, yes, this is an overlapping experience for a lot of PDA families. And then speaking to the ODD piece, we that one's a little bit harder, I think, to comment on, because probably what's happening at this point, you have families who, if they are going in for an evaluation, and Diane, add to this, please. In my thought, if you have somebody going in for an evaluation and they're completely missing the neurodivergent piece of this, they might fall into an ODD category, and then they might not receive the education and the information about neurodivergence. And so I think in our survey, we were probably limited in some ways because the people filling our survey out were people who were already familiar with
Mm.
PDA and the neurodivergent aspect of that. So that one, I do think that there's definitely more work to be done there to tease that apart. But yeah, I wouldn't want to comment
Right.
on that one as
And
specifically.
what we do know is that, it seems that more Black and brown children in America are much more likely to be given an ODD diagnosis and not have their neurodivergence looked at. And it's tricky because I used to kind of say no one should get that diagnosis. It's never helpful. But, some people have pointed out that's the only diagnosis available to certain segments of the population. Um, we just have so much work to do. And also, even with autism specifically, not as much ADHD, not everyone has access or can afford an evaluation for autism. And still, so many examiners or testers only identify the more stereotypical, obvious presentation of autism. So we have many PDA kids who, were told that they or their parents were told couldn't be autistic because they make eye contact, because they're so socially motivated and so verbal and creative and all that. So even getting that autism diagnosis is still hard for many people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the survey itself provides like a very early snapshot that
Mhm.
will allow us to ask some more involved questions as we go forward, I think is how I look
Absolutely.
at that co-occurring condition section of the report.
I agree. Even though the numbers were pretty high
Mhm.
about how many people have multiple co-occurring
Yes,
conditions.
not just one or two.
Right, right. So, and I do, just see that in the PDA community as well, which further complicates the presentation and the lives of PDA people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's just reminding me the other day I mentioned, as I was told, all of my alphabet diagnoses to
Yeah.
somebody. And I was like, well, yeah, it's actually really helpful that, yeah, I might have all the alphabets and my children might too. But if we aren't talking about these things and aren't
Yeah.
engaging in these conversations, how do we begin to make sense of them? And just
Yeah.
because, yeah, people, I'm not sure, your experience, and we probably won't have time to go into this, but I think it just comes back to that validation piece and
Mhm.
believing what
Yeah.
people are saying who actually experience this within their children, within their adult children, or just within themselves and in
Yeah.
everyday life. Yeah, so that belief and that validation and that community and coming together. That's why I love this research because it is so needed. And yeah, thank you. And something else that I think the listeners would love to know, Melissa and Diane, is about treatment. And that can kind of be a little bit controversial, at least from the parents that I support, and within our listener base. What, in your professional opinions, has come from the research about treatment options, if any, and the perspectives of those who have engaged within different treatments for their child or for themselves? Or yeah.
hmm I will say this was probably one of the hardest areas to analyze with the survey results because it is so complicated. Again, so much of this was just like a lay of the land snapshot, but we wanted to include as many different treatment modalities as we could that we know a lot of PDA families have exposure to. And then also just kind of briefly gauge, was this helpful? Was it not helpful? Knowing that there's all of this complexity around, was a child in burnout at the time that they were receiving this treatment? Information about the provider, information about how long they engaged in the therapy. So it was fairly complicated to put the results together. But in general, what we found was that across the board, families are finding things unhelpful to helpful. And, it makes sense. One of the things that we did see as far as the treatments that were most often tried, medication management through most of the time it was through a psychiatrist, and then also occupational therapy. Those were the two for our under 18 group were most commonly utilized. And I would say they had a fair amount of individuals who were identifying that as, yes, it was at least moderately helpful. We did have some people say that those weren't helpful strategies. But for all of our other modalities that we looked into different types of talk therapy. We looked into, we tried to look into more niche therapies, equestrian therapy, art therapy, different emergency room, inpatient services. For the most part, it was across the board. You really couldn't find a pattern. You had just as many people saying helpful versus unhelpful. The one area I will mention with most of the more, I guess I would say, hospital related treatments, individuals who had tried to access emergency room services, any inpatient treatment, they tended to list that as more non-helpful than helpful. And I think that that probably makes sense. Again, we need to do a deeper dive on the why there, but those are typically situations where a PDA or in a PDA family, they're going to lose a lot of autonomy and a lot of ability to make decisions for themselves because they have moved into a hospital system that typically is there to keep you safe and to, restrict certain access to things. And then ABA was another one that I know is controversial, but that more people tended to say less helpful versus helpful. So yeah, it was tricky to kind of make sense of that, but it seems like we just need more information about, for those people who were finding these services helpful, what specifically about that was helping, and how do we make sure that treatment providers continue to do those specific things?
Right. And teasing out kind of the provider from the modality, because it
Yes.
really comes down to the human, the person, the relationship, the connection. Understanding PDA is very helpful, but some people, just by who they are as a human, can connect with PDAers because they're genuine and flexible and they partner and collaborate. So I think that, hopefully will be something we can look at as the characteristics and approach of kind of therapists that work for PDAers, and maybe we'll find them across modalities. It'll be interesting to see, but it's a hard thing to pinpoint. I
hmm
do want to say for parents of PDA children, it's very hard not to send your child to therapy because everyone tells you if your child's struggling, you need to. But if your child doesn't have the bandwidth for therapy, if there's not a therapist in your area who is the right fit, then I'd like to take that pressure off families. You can be a very good parent and not send your child to therapy too. And it's just not possible for everyone.
Thank you.
Which I imagine is something that people are, like, breathing a sigh of relief in
I
hearing, you
hope
know?
so. I hope
In so many
so.
situations, yes, there's access to therapy, but I think deep down in their gut, a lot of families are like, "Oh, that's just not the right fit," and we're trying to show up every week and make this connection that could be making things harder, you know?
Right, and we're also, very clear, especially at PDA North America, that, therapy is not to make someone less PDA or less neurodivergent. We're not trying to fix the child. And I say to parents all the time, sending your child for therapy, if everything in their life isn't PDA affirming, is not going to be helpful. It's really for every adult who interacts with that child to understand them. There's no like sidelining that in the process.
Thanks. I think that's honestly like that is one of the missing pieces that I see all the time, specifically within education. When it's, you've got this one perspective of, managing a classroom, or you've got the other child's needs in this. And my biggest frustration is exactly what you said, Diane, is if there aren't systems and supports in place that are PDA affirming, if the educators and those who are around them, even the children, if they aren't hearing this language, it
Right.
doesn't need to be scientific, but just that we have differences in our sensory processing, how we
Right.
experience the world, how we respond to transitions and shifts in the day, and we all have different needs. So I do think that education, which I know we'll dive into in a moment, is that piece that may take a lot of time. And I'm, just trying to be realistic, but also validating because it is so important that that is a huge area that parents struggle. And not all children are able who are PDA to access education, or there's just so much stress involved for the family. So I do love how you've
Yeah.
given that sigh of relief, which I agree. I'm sure people are going, "Oh, thank you. If you just can't do that one more thing, like that's okay to kind of pull back." I know you were speaking about
Mhm.
therapy, but yeah, I'm really curious to hear how or what your findings were on either access to education or just school refusal.
I think it's fair to say that we knew this was going to be the biggest area of this report, and we wanted to do it justice as best we could in the snapshot that we did. For the under 18 group, who, the majority of these kiddos, they're actively attempting some educational process. 88% of them were experiencing some form of school avoidance or refusal at some point in their academic lives. And again, it's like in my bones, I knew that, right? I would have guessed that these numbers were going to be high, but to see it just consistently across
Yeah.
the board, that families were like, yep, this is a consistent thing. And it wasn't just that, yes, we've experienced this refusal. It was, we're experiencing this often to very often. This could be multiple times a week to every day where families are really struggling to have their children engage with whatever the educational program is. And that, I imagine, is also that connection sigh of relief piece, because you probably have a lot of families who are struggling with this in silence. They're looking around and they're
Right.
like, oh, well, the other kids in the neighborhood are getting on the bus just fine. Why am I struggling every single day to have this
Right.
happen? And when you can look at it and say, no, we're all in this together, this is a like consistent experience. Yeah, I think it says something about education.
Absolutely. Yeah, until we had that statistic, we were borrowing the UK statistic of 70%, which we thought was really bad. Yep. Turns out we are worse, not surprising too. And I think also in the report, it did show, and this is also something I knew but didn't know consciously maybe, is that even a child getting a 504 IEP didn't really make things change so much. And that was important to know. I do want to just say, just for my own regulation, I hate that term school refusal because
Hmm.
it makes it seem like the kids just being difficult. Like they could go to school, but they're refusing. and like putting the burn in.
Yeah, we even struggle with how to phrase that in the survey
Right,
because for us, it's not, some kind of oppositional refusal. It's like, no, I am shutting down, and my safety
right.
system is saying this is not okay. But so many people hear it as school
Yes,
refusal. It's almost like you
yes.
have to use that
You
phrase.
have to. I
I agree.
know. Yeah, for the survey, but I just wanted to put that
Yeah.
out there. When schools don't work for our kids, it doesn't make sense to send them there. And so often I like to say, you've got the kids who aren't cutting it at school and are getting in trouble. And then you have the kids who are masking at school, and the schools don't recognize that the student's even having a problem until they stop coming. They just hit that wall and they can't walk out the door one more time. And we spend a lot of effort trying to get schools trained and on board and understand PDA. It's such a quality of life issue for everyone involved.
Yeah, I was just looking back because I wanted to make sure my numbers were correct, but kind of going along with that, there were two things that in my mind are worth highlighting here. The amount of families who were trying to access a more non-traditional education, that was actually higher than I expected it to
Mhm.
be. We had about 25% that we could put into a category of a more non-traditional program, whether it be homeschooling, unschooling, online school. And then we had about 5% who were kind of some hybrid combination, where it may have been like we access the public school twice a week, but at home, we do something different. So around 30% of these families were saying that public school model doesn't fit for us. And that was kind of a relief for me,
Mhm.
just personally growing up, the idea of homeschooling was so foreign and, my upbringing that now that I'm homeschooling my two kids, it's almost like I feel this relief of like, okay, I'm not
Yeah,
alone in making this decision for my family. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight too, which is frustrating, and that's why I wanted to look at my numbers. 22% of the families that filled out the 18 and under 18 survey had said that their child had been suspended, and then another 6% had children who were expelled. And I'm looking at those numbers like that is high. That is insanely high that these kiddos are having that kind of an outcome
right,
in theory because they're just not feeling safe in the school. And
right,
what do you do about that?
right, and that's not even looking at seclusion and restraint,
Yep.
numbers too, which we f yeah,
If
yeah,
you're one of those families who's had your child be
yeah,
suspended or expelled from school, like, again, it's not your child, it just probably means that this is not the right fit for your kid.
yeah,
And the fear I think that a lot of families have around homeschooling their kiddos, and to be fair, I know that there are a fair portion of families who just don't have access to that. If both parents are working outside of the home and you don't have another caregiver that can provide that, that's its own logistical
yeah,
struggle that I want to acknowledge. I do think that like internal fear though of this isn't the right way to educate my kid. We've been told over and over again that you have to do it a certain way in this specific program. That can be a big hurdle in my mind for a lot of families taking that leap into a more non-traditional environment. So the fact that 30% of the families in the younger survey were doing it, again, you're not alone. The struggle is
yeah, right,
I think just hearing that, I don't homeschool my children yet, have the access to being an educator. And I know parents will learn as they need to along the way. But I think being very aware that the systems, our education systems, do not support PDA and a lot of the time just neurodivergent individuals in general. I find it helpful as a parent to kind of prepare myself because I know that so much work is being done in the space, but I'm working with families who are so scared that that will be their path. And I know, Melissa, you were saying that you do homeschool your children, and I just love that you've given that message that, it's not your child and they can be supported in a different way. Obviously, so many factors, like you mentioned, are involved. But yeah, I would love to see the education system do this huge overhaul. I don't know how realistic that is, but I think that is such like a driving piece, at least for myself, of knowing why the work and the research around PDA experiences for our youth, our young children, our adults, and valuing lived experience. That's why I just think that is so important that we're giving families that validation, those tools, and removing the barriers of isolation.
Well, we launched PDA and education training for schools this
Mm.
year. And we have kind of self-paced course, or we can do it live, like a bespoke um, kind of approach to training teachers. We try to make it easy for families. So we have a letter they can send their child's school. We can even approach their school directly because we need to have the buy-in from the schools. But we're trying, and slowly, some schools are getting behind it. But training is only so much. You have to actually put it in action. We're starting. We're also, I think, in the fall gonna do a little talk, to kind of the members of our micro school association, because I think that might wind up being a big part of the future of education for PDAers. These, it's usually a parent of a PDA who starts a small micro school, but we're always looking for alternatives because things are rough, and a lot of kids, even if elementary school can go okay, things can fall apart in middle school. So we want to be prepared.
Yeah. And I guess just to kind of
Yeah.
add to that as we're having this
Uh-huh.
conversation, well, one of the things that we've been talking about as far as like the research piece at PD North America, education is like front and center. Like, what are we doing with this
Yeah.
next? And trying to get some more data. But I was just thinking too, I imagine, and I'm just guessing here, but how many parents of kiddos in this education space are looking at this and honestly saying, like, I didn't sign up to homeschool my kiddo. You know, like,
Mhm.
this is not what I thought parenting was gonna be, but if I say that out loud, it might be selfish and I'm not putting my kiddo
Right.
first. And to have some of these more micro school models where the
Mhm.
kids do get the opportunity to be independent and the families can have that much needed break that they need for their own nervous system, I think both of those things are just huge. Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
saying those things out loud and actually, yeah, no,
Yes,
that
and it's o I'm not sure where I was, but it's okay for caregivers to need that break and to want that break and to have these school options so that the kids can not only get that level of independence and the practice there, but also for those caregivers to have a minute to themselves where they are able to focus on regulating their own nervous systems for at least a couple of hours a day. I think from a family systems approach, like, that's probably gonna be better for everybody in many cases.
And many PDA kids, you know, really want the peer connection and relationships, and, that's so important to them, so they're looking for that as well.
Yeah.
yeah, and I love how you spoke of the family systems, because I know it was within your experience report as well, but that when we just look at the child, yes, super important, but everyone needs to be on board, right? Like, it
Yeah.
affects everyone, everyone's understanding of the child, the support for the child, those wraparound systems that even though the child may seem okay, perhaps if it's internalized, they're masking a lot and then explode at home. Yeah, just the school might think they're doing this great thing, which may look on the surface that they are, but then at home, it's telling a different story. Having that, yeah, the validation and the support is huge.
Yeah. So for me, thinking about the report, we wanted there to be different levels of access to this report because we know people are going to have different levels of engagement. We do have on the PD North America website, we have our full 50-page report that has a lot more of the data in it. We put together a shortened report that's instead of 50 pages, it's more 25 to 30 pages with some snapshots in it. And then we are working on putting together some, we're thinking of them as one pagers. So we can have an education one pager, a treatment one pager, things like that, so that families can actually have something more condensed that they can bring to educators, treatment providers, that kind of thing. So be on the lookout. That'll be there soon.
Yes.
That's awesome. And I will make sure that all of those resources are linked in the show notes below or in the description if you're watching on YouTube. And Diane, I will pass this over to you. Is there anything else? You were speaking of trainings for schools. Is there anything else
Yeah.
coming up that you really wanted to share with the Attuned Spectrum audience?
Well, I'm hoping people will spend a little time on our website because we're always updating that. We have a 10-page guide explaining PDA. We have Insights, which is our blog. We just did a training for therapists that's also self-paced on our website. We have webinars almost every week, and all our webinars are kept in a learning lab that people can listen to, and we have downloadable resources. I also do want to make the point that we never turn anyone away from any of our virtual programming. So if you can't afford the little fee, like no questions asked. And we have a great newsletter and an annual conference. So spend some time on the website. And a fall conference now we've just started as well. So we are very obsessive and just keep doing more and more. We can't help it. So
Neurodivergent business brain.
yeah, I always say, why do we make things more complicated every year? But it doesn't seem like that's going to change.
No, and you're providing barrier-free access to those who need it, and I think that is amazing work, and I also just love how that you're not that yes, there is the option, to invest in a training, and then if there's something that you really are struggling with, just to know for families that that barrier can not be there is just really
Absolutely.
just so kind and just really shows, I think, from what I'm gathering, your value, and maybe personally
Thank
or
you.
just professionally as well within PDA North America. But yeah, just really caring in making sure that people who are looking for support are able to get it. So thank you.
I do want to say we know we're missing people, and that is painful for us. There are so many communities where PDA is not talked about, not recognized, and our hope is in the future we will be able to reach more marginalized communities. So we have a lot to do.
There's so many people coming out who, and I think it comes from that, I don't want to just, seclude like to the mother, but because obviously you've got different caregivers and parents and
Mm.
but it's somebody who cares for a child is going, this is not right.
Mhm.
Why is this so hard? Why am I not
Right.
trusting my gut instinct that
Yeah.
this area is not safe for them? It's not safe for their nervous system. And this is why I love these conversations because it brings us together. And I don't know how you feel, but I've got goosebumps just feeling hopeful. So
Feels good.
I really appreciate you both being on the Attune Spectrum podcast. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Diane, so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks
And
for
I hope
having us.
you're welcome.
Thanks.